thank you for your help today. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
So here's your slide advancer. That one's forward, that one's backwards,
Got
and
it.
there's your laser pointer.
Okay.
Here's your microphone if you like to wear this.
Sure.
Wander around.
Yeah, I like to wander around, pretend like I'm doing a TED Talk.
What I'll do, it's on now.
Yeah.
I'm going to pause it. I'm going to mute it.
Let me just see. Where's the button?
See that big old one?
This one. I just press that one time.
Yeah, and then it turns green.
Easy.
And I'll be standing by to make sure. Okay.
Easy peasy.
And I would probably put on, because you're going to tend to maybe be looking to your left a little bit more than to your right. So I would clip it on this side, maybe on your tie.
Yeah, or I can do it this side, right?
Yes, sir. Now, but to be in there, no, if you tend to look this way, you'll be looking away. But it won't.
So you're thinking,
it's not a deal
you're
breaker.
thinking the tie's better?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
But it's not a deal breaker.
I'll take your advice.
Okay.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Right down there, front row.
I appreciate your help very, very much.
Yes, sir. You just don't forget to tap that button. Your little light should be green, and then you're good to go.
Oh, I'm sure that somebody will remind me.
Okay.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for coming. There are all sorts of seats down here in the front they're safer than they look, apparently. We are so happy that you were able to find time to join us today. Everyone's busy and it's a commitment to come to these, but we have a lot of important things to talk about. We had a forum last week and on the Belknap campus, and I'm happy to say between those who were present in the room and those who were watching on live streaming, we had 300 participate. So plus whatever we have today, it's a very nice turnout and a lot of interest, appropriately so, given the important topics at hand. So thank you very, very much for your time today and your interest. And what we're going to try to do today is spend time on these topics. I have prepared some slides. But you'll be happy to know that the slides should only consume about 1/3 of the time that we have allotted for this. And so we're hoping to get through these in about 30 minutes and then leave about 60 minutes or however long you're all able to stay for questions and comments and really just to listen, because this, in fact, is part, as you'll see, of a February listening tour where we're really trying to become informed about the priorities and the concerns of as many people as we can on this campus and on the Belknap campus. So your input is really the primary reason we're here today. So these will be the topics, and we'll start a little bit with the process. And you know, as I alluded, February we've sort of set aside as the month where we are setting about listening to the concerns and ideas, and a lot of good ideas are coming in from staff and faculty and students who know their areas extremely well and are qualified to give important feedback about things that can be helpful in this process. And one of the comments I made on Belknap last week, and I think it's worth repeating, we have not put together a draft of this budget yet. All right, we are not at that stage, and I think there's always concern that our office is preparing something and we're going to spring it on the campus community at the last minute without any input or consideration. And I want to make sure you know that is absolutely not true. We're out listening and understanding what we need to do so that when we do put pen to paper, it's more like pencil, because it's going to have 20 versions with eraser marks all over it, that we're able to put something down that really is, as much as possible, representative of what it is that we have heard. So to that end, you'll see a whole host of different forums in which we have had these kinds of conversations and continue to have these conversations as the budget preparation process moves forward. And today, of course, we'll talk about the survey that so many of you took part in and go through some of those results. So you can see the list here, and I'm willing to consider any forum that is suggested. This is not meant to be an exclusive list. If there are other groups or other individuals that have an interest in weighing in on this and we can think of an appropriate forum in which to do so, by all means, let's try to schedule that, because we're trying to be as inclusive as we can in this process. So these are some, not all, but some of the activities that have to take place between now and June for the budget to be created. And you'll notice they have months listed as the targets for completion, and you'll notice that they're all in the future. So again, this slide is meant to point out that the work of creating this budget is really just getting underway, and that most of the work is still to come. So it is not too late to hear good ideas and concerns and for us to make adjustments accordingly. We're planning on doing an awful lot of that. But you'll see that some of these items revolve around issues that impact students, so tuition and fees and housing and parking and those kinds of things. Some of them are related to decisions that the state will make about appropriation levels and so forth. And so there's no way we can yet know the exact details of those decisions. I wanted to show this slide to reinforce the concept that the preparation of a budget, in my mind, is not just a one-year experiment. A budget is a guiding document, okay? So it's a way that the administration is able to set out priorities, make sure that those are in fact aligned with the mission of the institution, make sure that there are resources applied to those priorities, and then use that to see how we're doing throughout the course of the year, right? So it's not just a document that means something on a given day when the budget is passed. It's a guiding document that is used to set the priorities, fund them, and then follow the success or failure and make adjustments as time goes by. Now, that said, it's also not a single year process. So a budget process in a complicated institution such as a university really needs to be viewed in the context of what came before and what is anticipated to follow. So the year that we're in right now, the 17-18 budget year, as many of you know, was a reaction to a very unfortunate set of circumstances that we inherited a year ago. So this time last year, when we were in the process of crafting the 17-18 budget, we were learning about the problems that the university was facing. We were learning about the shortage of funds that were available and fungible for use. We were learning about a downtick in the funding from the foundation as part of their creation of a sustainable budget. And we were making dramatic adjustments so that we would have a balanced budget. And if we hadn't, we would have had a budget, as you all know, that would have been out of balance to the tune of about $48 million. And at that point, we were also facing probation by SACS. And 2 of the 9 things that were of interest to them revolved around sustainability and budgets and that sort of thing. So for multiple reasons, at this point last year, we could ill afford to have a situation where we really lost tens of millions of dollars. It was not financially supportable, and it would have probably created dramatic problems with our accrediting organization. So we put in place the current year's budget, which, no question about it, was a bit austere, and people have had to make sacrifices. There are no exceptions. I'll show you examples of that in a few minutes. And it's been difficult, but we've done it. But we've done it with the idea constantly in mind that that was not the end game, that this was nothing more than a bridge, and I think we used that same term last year, to a plan going forward that will mean much more than just a cost-cutting exercise, but rather a revenue growth exercise. Because really the only plan around which faculty, staff, and students can get excited is one of a vibrant future for the university that involves growth, of programs that are aligned with our mission, not one that is a sort of sequential cut. That's not ever going to lead to success. So, the year that we're preparing is really the bridge between the austerity of the year just completed, or about to be completed, and then the long term in terms of what are the goals of this organization. What are we moving toward, and what sorts of investments and decisions need to be made in order to support those long-term visions. So some of the questions that we can't answer today, but will certainly inform this process. When the General Assembly concludes its deliberation in Frankfurt about mid-April, will they support or reject the governor's recommendations about various appropriation levels? Of course, we're all familiar with the one involving post-secondary education. His recommendation is a 6.25% cut. That's inclusive of the 1% cut that we took around the end of December, so it's 5.25% more for a total of 6.25%. That's $8.3 million, so that's a real number. And it's something that we are obviously spending a lot of time advocating against, and we're not certain until the middle of April what the final outcome would be. But we have to be appropriately conservative given what we know about the resources of the state of Kentucky. Raises, we'll talk about this in a minute in terms of the findings in the budget survey, but we have not had raises for our staff for years here. That's not true at other institutions, the University of Kentucky being a good example. And so we need to think about what it would mean to build something like that into the calculus. Tuition, we held our tuition flat last year. We're proud of that. We have to decide what we're going to do about tuition next year. Consider that in the context of what the other state institutions are doing and what the appropriation level is. And then this concept of asset preservation. So when you have a big campus, or in our case, 3 big campuses, or 4, depending on how you count them, there are a lot of buildings. And many of them are beautiful, meaning they're old, and they make it look like a college campus, but they have to be preserved. And so we know that our combined deferred maintenance at the University of Louisville is about $600 million, which is part of a $9 billion shortfall around the state, if you consider all state post-secondary educations and all their facilities. So this is a real problem. The state is contemplating a program where a bonding capacity that is actually serviced by the state would become available to those institutions that are able to match the investment. And so in our case, $50.9 million over the next 2 years is potentially available if we can spend and or raise about $63 million during that same period of time. So this is a challenge and one that we have to think about. Not raising the $63 million or spending it means that we forego the 50.9, and it's given to another institution in the state that perhaps is able to match even a greater portion of their allocation. So these are all things that we really must give careful consideration to as we work on these budgets. So I'm really thrilled to say that 1,699 people filled out the budget survey. Thank you. These are time-consuming. We all receive lots of surveys, and it's always tempting to delete them, but many of you did not, and thank you for that. Our statisticians are confident that this is about double the number that would represent a statistically significant sample, so we've got some data here that's usable. And I just wanted to go through very quickly and talk about some of the numerical data, and then also some of the narrative content that people would electively place in the text boxes accompanying the questions. So the first question was, if we in fact do have a cut in state funding, how should we deal with that? And so the top choices you can see here, and the first one was a runaway winner. And I'm really glad, because this is the right way, I think, for people to be thinking. A strong revenue growth plan, that was over 60% of those who responded felt that growing was the answer. That's good, not shrinking. Growing is the answer, and that requires effort, and it requires buy-in. So that's why we're all here talking about this. Tuition increase, interestingly, was the second favored choice, followed by assigned unit budget reductions. So, sort of the order of these, growth, perhaps some change in tuition, with then cuts being a lesser consideration, although still one of the top 3 vote getters. Now, for those who chose to put something in the narrative box, the first choice was to reduce the number of administrators, and so I'm going to show you some slides on that. You have to have pretty thick skin when you do these budgets, when you send them out, because getting rid of administrators is always the first choice. Reducing low enrollment course offerings is something that is painful to do, but a lot of folks saw this as being an idea of value. And then there were comments about our athletics program. Is it too big? Are there problems with the way it's funded? Do some changes need to be made there? I put in a couple of slides here just to show you that I agree, actually, entirely with the concerns around the number of administrators. And this is both the administrators themselves and the staff associated with the administrators. So just very quickly, here is a snapshot of last year at this time versus right now in terms of our staff and administrative positions and salaries. And so we'll start with the staff. You can see that about $1.4 million worth of staff salary and benefits in the administrative realm have been eliminated, which is about 34 people altogether. But then for the administrators themselves, 14 off of 55 is the decrease, resulting in a bigger tally. So here almost $4 million in savings in administrative positions. So you add the two together, we have eliminated $5 to $5.5 million worth of administrative salaries and salaries for support staff in the past year. And I think this is a good start. I'm not suggesting we're finished, but I just wanted to show this to make sure that everyone recognized that we agree with the comment that the university had been heavy in terms of the number of administrative positions. Another question, what are some of the priorities that we should resource appropriately in the upcoming year? So the first one, far and away, was protection of positions. And that can be both faculty and staff, but overall protection of positions, followed by comments about introducing performance-based compensation. And we can talk about that maybe during the Q&A because it means different things to different schools. Restoration of unit budgets, and then salary increases was on the list, but it was the fourth most popular item. And I'll say at this point, this is really just some editorial opinion on my part. I'm very concerned about the fact that we have not had salary increases, particularly for our staff. And you know, that was actually not reflected strongly in the survey. There was a weaker than I would have predicted level of support for increasing salaries. I thought that was going to be an overwhelming priority, and it was not. Just want you to know that I still feel that that is a problem, and so I think we need to explore that a lot further. I'm not by any means swayed that we should ignore the issue of salaries entirely based on this survey, and we can talk about the rationale for that later. For the narrative responses, once again, the number of administrators, position protection, some people speaking out in the narrative section in favor of performance-based compensation, and equal number opposed to it. So those basically canceled one another out. And then once again, salary increases was on the list, but not high on the list. So here's a question that had an overwhelming response. Should we increase the number of students at the University of Louisville? I've never seen 90% of academic faculty and staff weigh in favor of anything. Usually things are much more debated and contentious than that, so seeing 89 favoring undergraduate enrollment growth and 88% favoring graduate enrollment growth, to me is a pretty strong mandate that this is how the campus community feels. Now, what would be the strategies around such enrollment growth? Okay, so the first one was to add new programs that are in high demand. This is something the university has not done much of over the years. We do offer about 200 degree programs at U of L, and while that's a lot, the number has been stagnant for quite some period of time. And that, I think, is an issue, and these comments reflect that. Growth in online programs came in number 2, followed by completer degrees, which we've discussed. Of course, we know that there are about 100,000 adults in the metro area who have some college, but do not hold a degree. So there is potential for some of those to come back and finish their education. The narrative comments, similar, although the emphasis here, I think very appropriately so, on preservation of quality, the idea being that we don't want to substitute quantity for quality. Could some of the recruits also augment our population of international students? Great idea. And should these programmatic growth goals be carefully linked to workforce needs in the metro and in the Commonwealth? And we've got data on that, and I think the answer is absolutely yes. Then there was a question about increasing tuition, and this one has a more typical academic response. 59 yes, 41 no. So, you know, the ayes have it, but not by a wide margin. There's obviously debate around this topic. So the follow-up question was, if we were to increase tuition, what types of factors should be taken into consideration? So benchmarking, in this case against other institutions in the state, would be an important exercise. Last year, we were the only state university in Kentucky that did not increase tuition. This coming year, Eastern Kentucky University has announced that they will hold their tuition flat. The others have not decided and are still discussing the possibility, as are we. You will probably note in the news, though, today, just sort of bowing to financial pressures, that Western Kentucky University was very sad to announce the beginning of some significant reductions in force, which I hate to see. They're going to let 140 positions go. 40 of them, they said, are unfilled positions. 100 of them are currently filled positions, and they described it as wave 1 of a reduction in force. So, you know, we're not in that situation, but it's just, I think, indicative of the fact that institutions around the state are all feeling some pressure, and this is why considerations around tuition increase have once again come forward for discussion. This is the narrative box, the conversation around, well, if we increase tuition, is it just a flat increase, or do we do something more creative around it? Should there be differential tuition where it's different for each school? Should there be tuition by credit hour, right? I mean, there's all different ways to look at a tuition increase. It doesn't necessarily have to be just a flat percentage. The ability to preserve a quality education, of course, was noted as one of the reasons that one would consider increasing the tuition. Again, benchmarking, but keeping the eye on student affordability all came to the front. Okay, so the next question really was more from your area. Okay, so if you look at just your school or your department, try to have a more local perspective. What are some strategies for cost savings that the university could explore? So here we go again. Reduction of administrators pops up to the top of the list. Once again, we see closing low enrollment programs, so that's a repeat. And then across the board reductions. A little bit of a surprise because usually people advocate against that because it's not as strategic, but it did come up as the third most popular response. And then in the narrative section, there were some interesting ideas, one of them around the creative types of scheduling, so making good use of facilities during hours of the day or months of the year when they are utilized to a lesser degree so as to maximize our resources. And then also looking at some energy conservation techniques, which I'm happy to say we are already doing and which need to be continually explored. There was a question about fundraising. So if we're out raising money from donors and we convince donors to regain their confidence in the University of Louisville, what kinds of things should we ask those donors to support? The first choice by far was scholarships. So there is a lot of emphasis on the need to support scholarships for students either that are need-based or merit-based, and donors are always a good source of paying for those. Capital/deferred maintenance, this fits in with the earlier conversation around asset preservation, and then fundraising for research. I was very happy to see was on this list as well. And then the final two questions had to do with how do you stay informed and how do you provide further input. So for staying informed, email was the runaway favorite, followed by meetings such as this. But in the narrative section, it was emphasized that there should be a lot of activities like this that are unit-based, in addition to campus-wide presentations such as this one. And I agree that a lot of this decision-making needs to be on a local basis. Email and town halls also popular. How would you individually like to provide feedback? The surveys seem popular, and we can do them again. The forums as well. And in the narrative, once again, emphasizing some activities at the unit level, not just at the university-wide level. So as I promised, 30 minutes, and I'm going to stop because there are a lot of you here. I have no idea how many are present on the live stream, but we'd like to hear your questions and your concerns. And I want to offer some public thanks. This process so far has been arduous. There are a lot of people working on this budget process. So Susan Howarth, who's our interim chief financial officer, is working day and night on this. We have Rick, where is Rick, has come to represent her today. There he is behind Craig. Dan Durbin, our CFO in the Health Sciences campus, and many in all of their offices who are heavily involved in the early stages of this process. We really appreciate your efforts, and they will be here to take fastidious notes today and make sure that all this input goes back and is incorporated. And I think, do we have microphones if people choose to ask questions? Okay. All right, those are live. Well, thank you all for being here. Oh, wait a minute, there's a question.
So one comment about understand that tuition increases may be necessary, the medical schools across the country are really under close scrutiny by the LCME to try and keep student debt manageable. And we know that for each, I think it's each 1% in rise in tuition, just to keep steady with our scholarships, we'd need another $1.5 million in endowments or something like that. So I wonder if you could comment on kind of trying to balance that. And actually, I'll let you answer that first, and then I have a question about the clinical.
Sure. So we have a tuition and fee setting task force, and they have been meeting and talking about this. And of course, there are students, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, who participate in that forum. And recommendations that come forth from that group have multiple components to them. There's an in-state undergraduate, there's an out-of-state undergraduate, and then there are professional school recommendations. So they are split out, and they are not one-size-fits-all types of suggestions. So for instance, on in versus out-of-state undergraduate tuition, often what will be suggested is, okay, well here would be a percentage to consider for undergraduate increase, but then for out-of-state undergraduate, it wouldn't be a percentage, it would be an equivalent dollar amount, so that it does not preferentially disadvantage out-of-state students. And then on the professional side, accreditation issues and the kinds of things you recommended here are always taken into consideration, and there's a hesitancy to increase already very, very expensive tuition in our professional schools.
Thanks. The other question relates to the clinical funding support, because at the School of Medicine, probably 2/3 of our budget comes from either professional fees from our docs or hospital support. We have been really pleased with being able to take back over control of University Hospital, and there's been some uncertainty related to Jewish Hospital. As we're getting more clarity, that's great. But one of the things that we are being faced with, as you know, is the investment funds or stimulus funds that Kentucky One provided for, but we really didn't anticipate that we were guaranteed ongoing support for, have now been kind of cooked into the budgets, if you will, and support a lot of faculty salaries. We know that there will be ongoing investments that would be needed in order to keep those. Can you just comment on how we might be thinking about that?
Sure, thanks, Tony. So your question sort of begs a conversation around the differences between what the budget looks like on the Belknap campus versus what it looks like on this campus, because they're quite different. So when we use the term general funds budget, which you hear that term used a lot, it's primarily two things. It's our state appropriation, which is around $130 million, just a little more than that, but which, as we've said, they're threatening to decrease by 8. But then it's also tuition. So, it never has made perfect sense to me why that's the case, but that's how it's defined. So the general funds budget is the primary components are the state appropriation and tuition, and there are some smaller elements that are included as well. On the Belknap campus, the general funds budget supplies a very significant percentage of the overall budget. Outside of general funds, the only real sources of revenue on the Belknap campus are extramural funding for research, which is, of course, much smaller than it is on this campus, donor support, foundation support, that sort of thing, and then the list starts to get really, really short. Okay, so that's a heavily general funds dependent campus. This campus has a much, much smaller percentage of its overall resources that are derived from general funds. We have a much smaller amount of state appropriation than the Belknap campus. We have a smaller student population, although they pay higher tuition per student. And so here we are heavily reliant on other sources. And so on this campus, of course, the research dollars are a lot bigger than they are on the Belknap campus. The hospital support dollars come and they're part of the equation. The revenue from patient service and associated upper payment limits for the service to Medicaid patients, all of those things become really significant pieces of the budget. And as you have pointed out, a lot of that has been in flux thanks to the change in our relationship with Kentucky One Health. So that's been a staged transition. Of course, we now manage U of L Hospital and our fate's in our own hands there, but the future ownership of Jewish Hospital is still being considered. And there is a company that's looking at purchasing Jewish Hospital, and we're in the early stages of developing a new academic affiliation agreement with them, but that still has an awful lot of work to go. In essence, we're going to have to make a very successful case to this company if in fact they purchase Kentucky One Health that our physician enterprise has to be supported. Because if they do not agree, what you're describing as basically stimulus funding that we had received from Kentucky One Health will end, and the sources for the salaries supported by that will end. And it's a big concern. And so, we're looking at a couple scenarios here. One where there's continued investment by a new partner, and one in which the investment ends. And it's a sobering scenario if there is not a replacement source for those funds. So this is, the hard work and heavy lifting that's going on right now, and it does have a lot of risk associated with it for those programs that were subsidized by hospital support dollars.
Yes, thank you for having this forum. My name is Whitney Tice, an employee with cardiovascular medicine. And as a staff member, I quickly scrolled through the number of survey results, and you highlighted the most commonly pointed out areas of interest in regards to handling the budget. Some of my other concerns, there's a number of things that you got to find dollars somewhere. I understand that. And I feel like over the last year and a half, there's been, through the emails that have been sent out regarding the budget, there have been an elimination of a number of different things that employees, regular staff enjoy. The bike voucher program was eliminated. Obviously, the Get Healthy Now has a fee associated with it. I'm sure parking will increase as a way to build revenue. Oftentimes, when a lot of these things are eliminated, we'll never see them back, right? We'll never get those benefits back. I'm sure the Get Healthy Now enrollment fee will increase over the next 2 or 3 years once everyone that's currently enrolled in trying to build enrollment with that gym. So if we got to find the dollars, fine, we got to find the dollars. But as an employee, I feel like we are losing a number of these small benefits. But we're not really seeing in the administrative side what is being lost there. Our per diems being decreased, our travel expenses being decreased, our faculty lunches still being paid for by departments. Where are those dollars being cut, right? So dollars are dollars. You amount them up and it includes to, how much have we cut. So I guess that's kind of one of my overarching concerns as an employee working for a university, your overall compensation package. When I look at some of these survey results, getting rid of Get Healthy Now, changing the 403B match, while small in percentage, could be items of interest in terms of generating revenue. So that's one of my concerns, and I don't know how you all will address those. And then the other is that, and I'm glad to hear that you're concerned about salary increases, the fact that the University of Louisville in general underpays its employees when compared to other ACC schools. And as you stated, the University of Kentucky is providing salary increases, whereas U of L hasn't over the course of a number of years. And so there's a difference between the salary increase and the standard of living increase. So when do we get a standard of living increase in addition to the salary increase? And so those are two of my concerns, and I don't know how you'll approach those.
Okay, well, thank you. There's a whole series of questions. Let me try to touch on several of them. They're all good questions. So when we created the budget last year, the primary goal was to try to preserve positions. So the goal was to try to avoid a RIF, right? And so we did not have an across-the-board RIF. We've had attrition, but we didn't have an across-the-board RIF. And the way that was possible, given the $48 million hole, was through being careful with some of the kinds of things that you've described. It was a trade-off. You know, we could have preserved all of those things, and then we would have lost X number of positions, and that wouldn't have been popular either. So, I mean, there were a couple of bad choices there to select between. I do want to point out that while you mentioned here that we showed the top choices, the raw data from this survey is available to everyone. So I just don't want anyone to get the impression that because, for the sake of this brief 30-minute presentation I gave, I didn't want to show 200 comments for each question. You can see them, okay? It's all there, and we're not trying to hide anything, and the items that did not bubble up to the top 2 or 3 are not being ignored. I mean, we're looking at all of those. I was just trying to say, okay, here's what, the bulk of respondents were focused on. So a couple of other things that come to light in what you said. We have to give a lot of thought to our benefits and how we're spending money on benefits. And so I have challenged John Elliott, who's our Interim Vice President for Human Resources, to help me put together an analysis which is sort of like a total compensation package for every employee. And this is a step in a process to look at the possibility of more of a menu-driven approach to benefits. So let me describe what I mean. So every employee who works here has benefits associated with that position. So you have, contribution to your retirement. There's a health benefit. There's a whole list of things, right? Tuition remission. You go down the list. There's a whole list of things, and a lot of people don't realize what all these things are because not every person takes advantage of every benefit, depending on your personal circumstances. And so, and a lot of people don't realize the cost to the institution of some of these benefits. So there really is a dramatic amount of expense associated with benefits at U of L. It can be 30% or more on top of whatever a person's salary is. Now, what some places have done is really try to break that down. And first of all, the first step is to make everyone aware of what it is that you're really receiving so that you understand the total amount of compensation that the university is providing in combination of salary and benefits. That's the first step toward considering what would a menu-driven approach to this look like. So some institutions give you a list of options. It's like, well, health insurance is really important to me. Tuition remission is not, because I'm not going to be going to college and I don't have children who are going to college. But gee, I'd really like to be able to go to the Get Healthy Now gym for free, right? So you opt out on the tuition and you opt in on the Get Healthy Now. Maybe that's not the best example, but you get the idea. I mean, you have some choice in terms of the benefits that are of value to you. It doesn't cost the institution anything because it's just a cross-substitution, but it's of more value to the individual employee. We're looking at that and seeing if that's feasible, what that would look like, how many people it would favorably impact, and we'll come back to that. That's not something we're going to be able to get in place by July. It's a bigger project than that, but we're working on it. So I hear you. I don't like, cutting benefits either. But the one part of your question was, have any benefits or costs associated with administration been cut? And the answer is absolutely. So I showed you already the $5 million worth of positions that were cut. But in addition, we're putting in place a new program for cell phones. We've cut $250,000 worth of cell phone reimbursements out of next year's budget, which preferentially impacts administrators. We are also, Dan Durbin helped engineer a program around food and rules about ordering lunches for meetings and that sort of thing. And Dan, how much money did you cut out of that? another 250,000 there. So absolutely, nobody is spared, and I think these things begin, with the folks who have responsibility for the decisions.
On one of your slides, I think it might have been the one about the timeline, there was some mention of a new budget concept. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, whether the process this year is different from years past, and what your vision for kind of the future process for generating the budgets at the university might be.
Thank you. Good lead-in. So we have put together a task force that's going to have 15 or 20 members. There'll be some deans, some faculty from both campuses, staff from both campuses, some student impact as well, sort of a typical committee at the university, to look at how we set our revenue targets and basically how we begin to look at the generation of revenue within each unit. So the idea is that there would be a base budget for each unit, in many cases very similar to what it is now. So it would not be a revolutionary change in anyone's base budget. But the concept here is that that base budget assumes certain things, right? It assumes that there's going to be this many students. It assumes that this many of them are going to stay enrolled and actually graduate. Lots of assumptions, right, on the revenue to sustain the base budget that is provided. And therefore, each unit has a target associated with it. So, if your base budget is around having 1,000 students, you're going to have a target of 1,000 students. Now, if you are able to attract more students, or if you're able to increase retention rates and the total enrollment goes up, and you end up with 1,050 students instead of 1,000, then there's a direct benefit that unit would share in. And you'd have 5% more students than you had anticipated, and there would be benefit to the unit that could be passed down to the faculty and the staff who made that possible. On the other hand, if let's say only 950 students materialize, but you were given a base budget that was based on 1,000, there's going to be a revenue shortfall associated with that. And so there would have to be some withhold of expense that had been predicted in the original budget. And so it really is sort of a risk-reward type model that builds on the base budget assumption and incentivizes everyone to grow the revenues. So we just saw that 60% of respondents to this survey favored a strong revenue growth plan. And so in order for that to happen, people have to be incentivized to make sure that that happens. Now, one of the questions, a very good question that was asked of me on the Belknap campus the other day is, well, gee, wouldn't that kind of thing cause the units to become pitted against one another? So all of a sudden, I'm going to compete for students, and I'm going to steal students from another department to make it look like my enrollment is higher at their expense. And that's the last thing that we want to see. The idea here is that we would like to grow the enrollment through overall increased retention of students in all units, attracting new students through the addition of new programs, whether on campus or online, introducing completer degrees, perhaps certificate programs. I mean, we have to decide what we have the ability to offer, what is mission aligned, where there are workforce needs that support the idea. But that way, everyone has the potential to benefit. It's not a parasitic thing. It's not that one person benefits at the expense of someone else. So that's really all it is. There's nothing revolutionary about it other than there is some accountability, but then there's also the opportunity to share in benefit from the success. This has been done very successfully at other places, and we're not forging new ground here, but it is new for us.
Hi, Travis Davis. I'm an urban planning student over at the Belknap campus. One of the questions that I had with respect to the university basically having zero budget for research is, has there been any discussion among members of the board about putting together committees, ad hoc committees for each of the colleges, and coming up with strategies to reel in dollars from potential investors and so forth in order to fund the research that each of those colleges is wanting to do.
Absolutely. Let me try to answer your question as best I can. So the university is coming off of a very good year, $180+ million in research expenditures, but of course not all of those are funded by extramural dollars. Some of them are institutionally supported projects. So we have an opportunity right now. We're going to be embarking on a national search for an executive vice president for research and innovation. Dr. Bill Pierce, who served the institution admirably for many years, has decided to retire. And so that creates an opportunity for us to do a search. Now, with a search like this, I think comes the opportunity to create perhaps new models or new understandings of the current needs of the organization. And some of that is finding ways to augment the extramural support, because as foundation funding and NIH and NSF and those kinds of funding sources become more and more competitive, the need for contributed dollars to help augment that becomes greater, as does the need for funding through novel partnerships such as academic industry partnerships and those kinds of things. So in the process of constructing this search for a new EVP for RI, I think it's incumbent upon us to have representation from all the schools to help understand perhaps what sorts of things could be targeted that we have not been doing a good job of targeting historically, to build more of an anastomotic framework to support some of these fragile needs.
Sure. Well, you had mentioned with respect to sustainability, and I believe you had used the term renewable energies, is that right?
That's the Conn Center at the engineering school.
Okay. Well, with the new sustainability program that's in place, and the university's climate action plan, the climate action plan is dated, it's 2010. It's pretty clear in there that one of the primary objectives is to get all the dated buildings up to LEED standard for existing structures. Mm-hmm. We don't see that happen. And I think a professor that I spoke with, poli-sci professor over at Fort Hall, made a good point that energy is just so cheap here in Kentucky. I'm a California transplant, and it is rock bottom, dirt cheap here in Kentucky, but I think this statement is relative in the fact that this is a research university. The target market is global. We're selling the university is selling an idea of we can do this with this. To harness renewable, something like renewable energies, and use that as a mechanism to reel in investors. So I'm just wondering if there's been any discussion among the board or any committees on strategies to reel in those investors so that we can conduct that research.
Well, around the specific topic that you're referencing, no, I'm not aware of any conversations like that. But what your question does point to, is the need for the university to progressively engage all of our schools in conversations around research opportunities. I think historically, research here has been concentrated, in a couple of schools that do a lot of it. Some of it goes back to the original distribution of the Bucks for Brains chairs. Some of it is just based on the areas of expertise and the fundability of various types of projects. But, there are great ideas like this that come out of arts and sciences and other schools that typically have lower levels of funding for extramural research, and it doesn't have to be that way. There are good opportunities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Here comes Irv.
The question that comes to mind, I've been here for too long probably. We're in a mode of, I guess we're dying a death of 1,000 cuts here. And and we're looking at ways in which we can conserve and maybe make a cut here, a cut there, so that we can somehow survive. I really think if you look at large businesses, and I'm not saying we should take a business model, I think we need to look at what things we can do and do well, and what things that might need to be done, we might need not do those, so that we can take the resources we have, and instead of cutting programs, those programs that I think that we can really excel at, we need to be putting monies into those. I really don't think that we're going to get any time in the foreseeable future additional revenues that are coming in from the state. I think even with tuition, if we go online and so on, we'll get some funds coming in. But when you look at what our needs are, which are many, I don't think that that's going to cover it. And clearly, research doesn't bring in extra money, and technology transfer is an iffy thing. If somebody comes with a Gatorade, we can really make hay with that. But those are things we don't know whether it'll happen in a year, 10 years, or 20 years. I really think we need to look at how this university can position itself, looking at what opportunities are available, and looking at things that we can do well. And even though some people don't like that of saying that we just stop doing some things, we stop doing some things so that the entity that comes about after we do that is a stronger entity that can be self-sustaining. So just your ideas on that.
So Irv, your comments point to both concentration of resources, but also to the need for growth. So if we go back to some of the questions from the survey, let's reflect on some of them. One of them, 90% of respondents agreed that growing enrollment was a valid thing to consider if it's done properly. More than 60% favored strong revenue growth strategies. And so to me, those are responses that argue against a death, as you described, much less a death by 1,000 cuts. I have no interest in being part of a death by 1,000 cuts. That would not be something I want to stick around to watch, and I'm sure I wouldn't be allowed to anyway. So the concept here is around the growth of the school. And so let's look at what happened at the University of Cincinnati. I was just up there the week before last. And the reason being, and we've got a friend there who's the president, but aside from that, there are some similarities at the University of Cincinnati. They have a budget that's very similar to ours in size. They attract students from the same region of the country. They offer many of the same programs. They have a medical school. They have an athletics program. There's a lot of similarities. And if you go back in time to like 2011, they had 10,000 fewer students than they do today. If you go back to that same point in time, their liquidity was far worse than ours. They were down to $50 million, which for an institution that size is just scary. So what they did in 2011 is they put in place this PBB program. It's a performance-based budget, and it's nothing more than the question that was asked here earlier, this new concept where there is an opportunity for everyone to work together and share in the benefits of growth and have some expectations. And they completely attribute a change in the following 7 years that allowed them to add 10,000 students, and their liquidity went from $50 million to today it's over $500 million. So they have not suffered a death by 1,000 cuts. That institution has grown substantially, not in a year, but in a reasonable period of time, over a 6-7 year period. Now in Kentucky you might say, well, is it possible for us to add that number of students? There's no question there is. We have done research to understand pent-up demand for different kinds of programming, and we've drilled down to look at specific course offerings that would be in demand, things that we don't do today or things that we do today in insufficient quantity. Some of them are on campus, some of them are online, some of them are hybrids, the completer degrees, all the different things we have talked about. And then the concept of just increasing our retention. 53% is our 6-year graduation rate. To me, that's sickening. You asked me, one of the things that bothers me the most at U of L is the fact that we don't graduate half of our students. We cannot continue to do that. So we are putting in place a donor campaign with the help of our overseers to generate the funds that will be necessary to support our students the same way we support our student athletes. And guess what? They graduate at rates 30% higher than our population of undergrads in general. It's unbelievable, right at this school. So just graduating the students that we have, albeit that takes resources, but just graduating the students we have increases the enrollment substantially. So it's this combination of things, Irv, that we just have to grow. Now, your other comment about the concentration of resources, I think resonates here as well. You've seen people say, you know, drop low enrollment programs, or if we have research programs that, you know, no one's been able to get funding for 10 years. I mean, there are things that we probably need to stop doing so that we can take those dollars and invest them wisely in areas where we do have opportunity. I agree with that as well.
Afternoon, Craig Blakely, Public Health. One more comment on research. I sometimes tire of hearing the generic, overgeneralized comments about research costs university money. There's a lot of truth to some of the data that's generated that's generally tied to heavily lab-based research. There are a lot of social sciences, and I would cite public health as another illustration of research engines that bring in lots of money and have very little infrastructure cost. We generate number 2 expenditures per FTE faculty behind medicine at the university, and almost 30% of our faculty time, FTE time, is sold on extramural dollars. And the lab group that we've got does a pretty good job, I think, way at the top in terms of generating dollars per square foot. So be careful how we generalize. So that's just a comment. Question for you, sir. We are looking at interesting times with respect to the continued 15-year trend in the state to cut dollars supporting education. One of the phrases I like to use, the best thing we could do to increase population health in the state would be to educate the electorate. Well, that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Education, I think, in general is a big issue. The cuts to P12 as well as post-secondary education are alarming, to say the least, and we are losing faculty because of that. I know that the university likes to funnel the messages that go to Frankfurt and Washington through channels, and for the most part I think that's very appropriate. But I think it's also a point in time where these issues are so substantial. We continue to see investment in retirement funds as opposed to tomorrow's leaders. Very short-sighted. We had a visitor from the governor's office at the CAO meeting the other day talking about economic development. I decided I should probably stay in my seat and not raise questions with that person because I didn't think it would be a productive conversation. But it seems to me we need to do a lot more about recognizing the economic engine that this university is, the economic contributions to our community. Those numbers are out there. I've heard you speak to them on some occasions. We're now in a position where we only have a couple of months left with what the legislature is going to do with budget at best. And I know we're pushing hard centrally, but there's a lot of us in this room and across campus that have connections with legislators, and I'm wondering if it might make sense for us to help prepare some directives to some of us to make those contacts directly using messages that are supported by the university centrally.
So, Craig, thanks for those comments. Let me try to address the 3 or 4 things that you mentioned. For your first comment about research, you're absolutely right. You can't generalize how research is supported and or subsidized because it's a regional phenomenon. But you know, it's something across the whole entity that we do have to look at because the resources to support those areas that are not self-sustaining have to come from somewhere. But you're right, it's not a level playing field. Some areas support themselves and some areas don't. Your comments about advocacy are equally important. You know, I've been in Kentucky for 24 years and have probably seen 20 budget cuts in 24 years, and sadly, you know, it's crossed over political lines. There have been Democrats in charge that have cut budgets. There have been Republicans in charge that have cut budgets. It's not necessarily a political thing. It's a lack of prioritization by the state of education, which is very hard to understand in a state that has metrics that show the desperate need for education at all levels. This is a big concern and something that we all worry about. Our colleagues at UK obviously have the exact same dilemma that we do, trying to face this reality. There's no reason we can't do a collective advocacy campaign, as you describe, and get some messages out in the next couple of months that faculty can, voice their opinions around some prescribed talking points, and we'll do that. John Dries is here, and we can work on that with Shannon Rickett, our government relations AVP, and come up with some things. Obviously citizens are always free to reach out to their legislators as well, not in an official capacity, but as a voter, and that's welcome. But we will come up with some talking points around which we can advocate. I'll mention that the government does have the one hint of optimism in all this is an area of the state government called the Economic Development Cabinet. And so this is one of the governor's cabinet members. His name is Terry Gill, and he's a very, very bright guy. He lives in Louisville, works in Frankfurt, and his job is to figure out how to increase the economic engine of the state of Kentucky and what kinds of investments are necessary to do this. And so it won't surprise you that he has run up against workforce need problems. He's seen industry that has decided not to come here because there aren't enough educated workers, and they can't possibly locate and expect to fill all the positions because they wouldn't be able to operate their businesses. And so he understands that. And so, to him, we have sent revised economic impact studies. The university just completed a refresh on its economic impact study where we showed the aggregate benefit of the University of Louisville to the metro and to the whole Commonwealth in terms of the kinds of things we generate, the number of employees, the tax base that represents, all the different pieces that together define the economic impact. And so he has taken a great interest in this, and he's been meeting with us on a regular basis. I think he came to CAO not long ago, and we've been meeting individually with him on a number of occasions. He wants to help us find ways to generate the money needed to increase our enrollment and as a byproduct, increase our viability. It's the first time I've seen a branch of the state government reach out and try to be proactive about working with us to change our business model in such a way that we can have a little more sustainability and not be so dependent on just that one appropriation number, whatever it happens to be. Because quite honestly, until the government takes a hard look at its overall responsibilities and income, there's going to be pressure on appropriations. $11 billion is the total tax revenue of the state, which is simply insufficient to cover all the needs. And there's not much of an appetite for tax reform, and that creates a stalemate. And so, we have to change the dialogue, and we have to change our business models so that, we become progressively less dependent on that single number. Because that single number is never going to change enough to solve all our problems. The government could say, all right, you're going to get a pass this year. We're not going to do this 6% cut. And we would celebrate, and we'd say, okay, we've got $8 million. But in the scheme of things, in the grand scheme of things, is that enough to change the picture here at U of L such that we don't have to worry anymore? Absolutely not. I mean, that would be a nice thing, and we would be very happy about that, but that's not going to change things. We have to change the model here and become progressively less dependent on that single number. Go ahead, Irv. I can hear you.
We've heard a lot about community engagement, and I think that community engagement is probably an area that we might want to put more emphasis on. Is that we need to partner not only with people in the community, but people in the business community, so that is an area where they have needs and we can meet those needs. And I'm not saying trying to target and do partnerships, target businesses, target organizations, so that with those partnerships, not only do we have support of the university, but as far as political support too, we have that because we're a more integral part of the business community, not only in Louisville, but for the state. I think that's an area that we as faculty and as staff, we don't get, it's kind of community engagement is, well, if you're doing some nice thing, then let the university know, versus being really proactive and saying that we've got a mission to meet individuals in this area doing community engagement because it's good for the university and good for the university to do that and help and direct.
Yeah, amen. I couldn't agree with you more. Or, you know, community engagement is something we actually do well, and we could do a lot more of it. So here's an example where we could emphasize something that we already value and we've already had experience with. And, you know, it comes in so many different forms. So Passport, our Medicaid managed care company, as you know, is getting ready to make a $90 million investment in a facility in West Louisville that will create a significant economic engine there with retail, healthcare, education. There'll be 1,000 people employed in that area, and try to create a different milieu at West 18th and Broadway. You know, our signature partnership initiatives have really attracted a lot of attention and are, I think, a way that we will be able to drive a support network and bolster the west side of Louisville. On Friday night, I was fortunate to be able to attend the James H. McMillan National Conference on the Black Family, which was a great constellation of business leaders and others in West Louisville who were, celebrating ways to increase the health and safety and well-being of families in that part of town. And Congressman Yarmouth was there and a lot of others. It was very obvious that there was a lot of support for the kind of thing that we're involved in. But the community engagement, as you describe it, can also mean our industry academic partnerships in terms of engaging with businesses in the community around helping them with product development, like our First Build initiatives or our Hive or our efforts around the development of these partnerships. These are all things that we do well, but I don't think we do enough of. And I appreciate you bringing it up. Craig?
Yeah, so this is a follow-up a little bit on Dr. Gansel's comments that the hospitals are critically important for financial support for medical centers. And Louisville is actually very unique in that we rely on several hospitals over which we have no control. So if you contrast that with where I did my residency at the University of Pittsburgh, they have about 40 hospitals that give them money. And in fact, they're just recruiting a couple of our faculty right now for a liver center. So I think it's critically important when we negotiate our contracts with these hospitals that we align our requests with their needs and their expertise. And this hasn't necessarily happened in the past. And there's actually not been good transparency on this. And so I think especially when we're dealing with a new group that's looking at Jewish, why we make absolutely sure that we take into consideration their needs.
Craig, your question, the timing of your question is uncanny. So 2 hours ago, we were meeting with Norton Healthcare, with whom we've got a great arrangement with around pediatrics and a terrific partnership, and we were making it very clear to them that the needs of our faculty are aligned with their needs to grow and sustain their mission, and that the levels of support we're receiving today are simply not adequate, and there was receptivity to that. Last week, we were meeting with Blue Mountain Capital, the company that's looking at the potential purchase of Kentucky One Health, and we made it clear that we're 50% of the activity at Jewish and Fraser, and if we don't have the level of investment to sustain those programs won't exist. And so, I think this dialogue is not just appropriate, but it's critical for us to, garner the support we need.
And I would say also, even in adult medicine, boards plays a big role. So the support that we get for the effort that we put in, we probably get our best support from Norton. We had a large CME symposium this past weekend, and Norton physicians were the most representative of any group in town.
Good afternoon. My name is Tiffany Robinson. I'm a development officer at the School of Public Health. And I'm not sure if you're aware of the high level of attrition among the frontline development officers. And I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that and just urge you hopefully to address some of those retention issues, because I feel like our capacity toward fundraising and community engagement is definitely adversely affected. I know there's a lot of recent leadership changes, so I think we're hopeful for some changes there.
I'm so glad you've brought this up. So, our development office is in a state of flux. Flux is not always a bad thing. It brings with it an opportunity to redesign and reinvigorate some functions that are critically important for the university, and this, of course, is one of them. So we've got vacant positions. We've had turnover, and we're going to be bringing in some outside consulting resources to help us manage our development functions in the short run and help us understand the level of investment that's necessary there and how to settle down the workforce and really understand the problems and get to the core of it so that the turnover stops and that we recruit the kinds of people we need. There are holes, there are places, Jim Erickson here in the front row has done a great job working with us on various development projects, but he'll tell you there are schools and departments all over the place where there are all kinds of potential donors, and there are no development officers. We just haven't filled positions. They're missed opportunities, right? And development takes a lot of work and a lot of time, and we have to have an adequate workforce. And so your comment is absolutely appropriate, and you're going to see a big change probably within the next couple weeks.
I'll kind of follow up on Tiffany's question. In public health, we've lost 2 faculty over the last couple months who are some of our biggest grant getters. And I'm wondering what sort of efforts we're going to do to retain junior faculty, mid-career faculty, to prevent them from taking their grant dollars elsewhere.
So I'll try to answer your question in a generic sense, and then obviously Dr. Blakely will be able to speak more directly to the circumstances of those couple of people, because we can't get involved individually with every single faculty member. But my feeling is that for faculty members to want to stay at a university, it's not just salary. Okay, that's part of it. Obviously, everybody wants to be paid fairly, but they have to have hope that where they're working is headed in the right direction. They have to feel like they're making a difference. They have to feel like they've got a team that is supportive of them and is able to, meet the needs and provide the resources they need to be successful. And, this almost gets back a little bit to Irv's question earlier about, concentrating resources. I mean, we have to concentrate our resources around areas where we have people who have either current success or the potential for success, and make sure they're supported and make sure we understand that what they are doing fits with the overall mission of the university so that it's more likely to be supported going forward, as opposed to something that's maybe very interesting and successful but peripheral to the main mission of the university. Those things are harder to justify. And I think this is the key, and what would be challenging each of the deans to do is really to evaluate everyone in their organization, whether they're involved in research or teaching or clinical work or community engagement, whatever they're doing, and understand, is it really mission aligned? Is it synergistic with things in other schools on both campuses? Is it the kind of thing that's going to drive success, or is it random? And I think that's a tough conversation because obviously the answer is not everything is going to be core. There was a really nice article written not long ago about this, and it was talking about how universities need to, focus their efforts around the things that really define them. As opposed to trying to do 100 peripheral things. And I've heard this comment now from 2 or 3 different people in different ways, but it's true. And universities are notoriously bad at subtracting. Universities do not like to close programs down and get rid of things. Universities want to add programs. But you can't do that. I mean, if you just keep adding, ultimately you're diluting your ability to invest in things that really have the potential to drive success. And so I think that's the answer to preventing departures like this in the generic sense. I mean, there may be, specifics around these two people. I'm sorry to hear about it. I don't know what they are, but that's how I would answer it. Well, thank you so much. As usual, I'm accessible by email, as many of you have figured out, and other ways, and I'm happy throughout this process and always to hear your input and your concerns. Thank you, for your engagement. It means a great deal.